Okay, well, welcome everybody to this workshop, which actually, although hosted by the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies, is actually being driven by a piece of work that is being led by the Centre. I've forgotten what the full name of it is now. That's terrible of me. Hang on a second. The Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformation. I always just remember CAST, and I then realised that I don't always remember what the acronym stands for, but CAST have started to do some work on systems change, and we thought this was a fantastic opportunity for them to test some of their ideas with the Knoca community. So we're really grateful to Claire and to Stuart for offering this opportunity for us to engage with them on their emerging work. This is really a pertinent issue because for a number of commentators and a number of activists and even some policymakers and practitioners in this space, there's a concern that climate assemblies are a really good way of developing and more progressive policy options and policy proposals, but less good at engaging around systemic issues. Although, as I was reading in the draft report, and I've heard myself on occasion, there have been times when citizens have talked about systems issues, but that's not been a marginal part of the agenda, or they've been unable to follow that through. So this is a really exciting opportunity to think about whether or not this emerging practice of citizens' assemblies can deal with these systems questions. And what's great about the publication as well, or the draft publication, is it also raises this question about whether this is something that can be sponsored by government or needs to be run independently. Whether or not this kind of agenda needs to be set in a different way than we're seeing at the moment. So lots of really exciting lots of exciting conversation, I think, today. We've got the two authors, Claire and Stuart, who I'll introduce in a second, who will walk us through their ideas. And we're really honoured to be joined by two great commentators. Arantxa, who many of you will know from Deliberativa. She's one of the co-founders of Deliberativa, very active in Spanish citizens' assemblies, and Bobby Banerjee, who's a professor at the Bayes Business School at City University, London. Both of them, and he's an expert in a number of areas, including climate change and sustainability. So they're going to bring some really interesting perspectives, I think, on what we found. And then there's going to be plenty of opportunity for us to break out into smaller groups and to discuss what we've heard, to discuss whether or not we feel assemblies are a place where we can do the kind of much needed systems change work. Anyway, without further ado, just a reminder that you are being recorded. If you for any reason don't want your face to be recorded, then please turn off your camera. But without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to first of all Stuart, I think, and then Claire. Sorry, I'll get myself together in a minute. So Stuart Capstick, Deputy Director of the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations. Over to you, my friend.
Thank you very much, Graham. Let me try and share my screen and then get the slideshow going. Does that look okay?
It looks perfect. Thank you.
Perfect, brilliant. So yeah, hello everyone. As Graham said, my name's Stuart. I'm a senior research fellow in the School of Psychology at Cardiff University and very involved with the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations, the CAST Centre. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and give some introduction and background to the work that myself and Claire have been doing. I'll say a bit about how this builds on our previous research looking at climate assemblies, and why that has led us to thinking more about systems change in the context of the polycrisis, as it says here, or the climate and ecological crisis, which is often generally the focus of my work. So click next slide. Yeah, when the CAST Centre that I work in was set up in 2019, we already had a very strong emphasis in terms of our own research on deliberation and public engagement to understand how to address climate change. So, for example, some work that colleagues in CAST have been doing in recent years has involved various deliberative processes and workshops with members of the public in the UK and elsewhere. So we have a recent briefing paper from CAST outlining some of these UK research findings coming out of that work that you can see here on the slide. And just one example conclusion that has come from that research is that radical and ambitious responses to the climate crisis are possible and can be supported by people under the right circumstances, but they need to be seen as being fair and for support to be given for people to feel they can engage with them. Now, because of our interest in public engagement and deliberation on the climate crisis, we were keen in CAST to understand more about what was happening kind of with the new wave of climate assemblies and juries and other processes that were getting going just as our centre got going back in 2019. And so a number of us were able to carve out a bit of time to look at the UK Climate Assembly and the French Convention, as well as some regional processes. And we did various pieces of research linked to that, and we published a report drawing out some of our research conclusions, which you can see here on the screen. And I think from doing that work, looking at these processes, our shared view, I guess, was that they have many positives and much to recommend them. Personally, I'm still very enthusiastic about their use, but at the same time, we did develop some concerns and critiques that led us to do the current work that we're here today to discuss. So probably the basic concern I have is that the ways in which climate assembly processes have tended to be designed and framed have had a major influence, I think, on their recommendations, and just as importantly, the types of recommendations that come out of them. So if we look at the UK Climate Assembly, to start with, this was very much a top-down process. At the point at which citizens were able to consider the issues at hand, the types of framings and options available to them were already decided upon and quite highly constrained. And so for many of the processes, not all, but for many of the processes, people were only able to choose from or vote on a menu of predetermined options. So if we look at the case of air travel, for example, this is a figure from our CAST report on the Assembly, and I just want to use this as one example to show the options that were available to Assembly members in the UK Climate Assembly in relation to air travel. Now, I think air travel is important for other reasons. It happens to be one of the most damaging and economically unequal drivers of climate impacts. So, but when Assembly members were asked to vote for their preferred option out of 5 possible ones in terms of air travel in the future, they were asked to do this in the context of a proposed increase, or in one case decrease, in passenger numbers, and also in relation to technological change. And if you look at this here, you can see that of the 5 options people could consider, passenger numbers increase in all of them, apart from one, with the inconvenient issue of emissions being solved to a greater or lesser extent by technology. So these were the scenarios people had to look at. And what happened in the event was that the winning vote, if you like, was split between the technological change option, where technology did the work and there was 50% increase in passenger numbers, and what was described as a combined approach, which had some technology plus some limits on passenger growth. So those were supported at 14 votes and 8 votes, respectively. And that matter, it's quite technical detail, but it matters because the formal recommendation from the UK Climate Assembly was for a future in which air passenger numbers increased by 25 to 50% by the year 2050. So it was a mix of those 2 options. And the point I'm trying to make here is that this very narrow framing of options, which itself was predicated on hoped for technological change and continued growth in aviation, resulted in a recommendation to keep increasing passenger numbers and in effect keep growing the airline industry. And something similar emerged in the transport theme again, in relation to when to phase out petrol and diesel cars. The options again were presented in terms of levels of reduction of car use and a date for a ban on fossil fuel cars. So the reason I mention these examples is not just to try and pick holes in a process. all assembly processes have their ways of doing things. No process can ever be perfect, and it, of course, has to be done one way or another. But the point I want to make here is that doing it this way means it operated firmly within current paradigms and ways of thinking about things, and for the most part didn't challenge or question those ways of thinking about things. So Becky Willis, who was one of the 4 expert leads for the UK Climate Assembly, articulated this quite nicely herself when we interviewed her for some other work, when she said that there had been a reluctance in the UK Climate Assembly to talk about power issues. There was a tendency to talk about technology rather than asking questions about money and power and influence and where that should be held. So the direct quote from her is shown on this screen here. And turning to the France's Climate Assembly as well, something that Claire has highlighted from her experience of observing the process, and this is in our draft paper 2, was the fact that Assembly members did actually raise one key aspect of the underlying system that's driving environmental problems, but they were not actually able to pick up on that and to consider it in any detail. So what happened here was that at the first weekend of the Assembly, citizens from all 25 tables present spontaneously brought up the issue of GDP and growth as a metric when they were asked to consider the levers and the obstacles to change. And in fact, the joint statement that came from the citizens across those tables was that, it says here, the obsession with growth, GDP indicators and the logic of profits is a blocker to the transition. The logic of financial interest takes precedence over the common interest. But although this came from citizens themselves, there wasn't an opportunity for them to discuss things like more transformative economics or other alternative approaches that challenged the current paradigm as part of their deliberations. And in fact, when the process was over, Emmanuel Macron made a point of saying that citizen assembly members had in fact turned their back on degrowth. So all of this sort of gets us to the point where myself and Claire and others in CAST have sort of feel that when it comes to climate change, we need a more systemic approach. It's something we can't avoid, we shouldn't try to avoid, in that the climate crisis and the ecological crisis are completely wrapped up in society's systems and structures in ways that some other issues are not. So sometimes climate change is described as a wicked problem in those terms, precisely because of the large number of complexities, uncertainties, and connections involved. So climate change is a problem that involves culture, power and politics, economics, ethics, science, colonialism, capitalism, technology, and everyday life. And so that means it's a complex and difficult problem, and it also means it's a systemic problem. So that's what we've tried to take as our starting point for recognizing what we are trying to deal with here. So that's kind of an introduction. I'm going to hand over to Claire now, who is going to talk about some of the suggestions and recommendations we had for how to approach climate change in that more, well, the polycrisis in that more systemic way. So I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Stuart. So I'll share mine now. Here we go.
It's a requirement of all Zoom meetings that someone at some point has a problem with sharing their slides. And,
Here we go. Can you see it now? It should come up.
we saw it for a second and then it disappeared.
You should see it now. Is that?
No, we're just seeing a loading.
Loading, it might take a while then, as you did before.
There it goes. Oh no, that's the old one.
Here we go.
Okay, fantastic.
Thank you for your patience. So the questions we are trying to address in the briefing is how can citizens' assemblies help navigate the systemic transformation required by the polycrisis? And we framed it as the polycrisis because climate is one element of the crisis we're facing, and we're using a definition for the purpose of this briefing, which is the polycrisis is defined as the causal entanglements of crisis in multiple global systems that significantly degrade humanity's prospects. So it's really important just to remind ourselves that actually the climate crisis is part of a wider crisis. And this briefing has been informed by various processes, including more specifically Climate Assembly UK, the Convention Citoyenne, and the Global Citizens Assembly. We're sharing here a draft for feedback, and we'd love to get your comments on it, and we'll share a survey with you during this call. The key element that we use to inform our thinking is basically a focus on power literacy to understand how citizens' assembly can deal with systemic aspects of the present crisis. And to do that, we've used a framework, which is the Power Cube from John Gaventa. Some of you might be familiar with it. And the reason why we thought it would be a really useful tool is because it's looking at power from multiple perspectives. And we feel there's a need for power literacy when we explore citizens' assemblies. And it's currently, as Stuart mentioned, not fully acknowledged. So if you can see on that slide, the different levels, spaces and forms of power. And the levels are obviously from the local to the global, which was really useful when we're thinking about the Global Assembly, for instance, and the different elements it's bringing compared to national level, which is national and local have been the levels where most citizens' assemblies have taken place so far, but there's a lot of learning we can get from the global level. In terms of spaces, this is really surfacing the fact that there are actually what's called closed, invited, and claimed spaces. By invited spaces, this is more what other people describe as top-down, for instance, citizens' assembly commissioned by power holders, whether it's a parliament or the executive, but also claimed assemblies, which would be more defined as a bottom-up process, either initiated by civil society or community groups or other groups with no formal institutional power. And finally, what's really critical in terms of power analysis is where power lies and whether it's visible, hidden, or invisible. In terms of the definition of invisible and hidden power, what's really important is to look at the hidden power. So who sets the political agenda? And some institutions have actually a lot of power in that sense. And this is an example that Stuart mentioned about the Convention Citoyenne, for instance. Who sets the agenda? Who has the power to claim what needs to be on the table? And in terms of invisible power, this is what shapes meaning and what's seen as acceptable, and what for instance, is considered, up for discussion. So just to give you an example, and there's more obviously in the briefing, but this is looking at hidden and invisible power when we look at these three assemblies and what questions were up for deliberation. And you can see there on the left-hand side in the column, you can see that both Climate Assembly UK and the Convention Citoyenne had very specific framing questions which looked at the issue of climate in a way that was oriented towards practical, actionable responses, but nevertheless that framed the issue as a kind of long time scale and technical matter rather than requiring near-term and urgent action, with implication for wider society. And in both cases, these questions were either shaped by the Commissioning Select Committee for the Climate Assembly UK, or in a more co-created way for the Convention Citoyenne. It was a negotiation between a civil society group called the Gilets Citoyens and representative from the government. And you can see that that's actually manifested in the aspects of the social spirit of social justice, which was added and brought a level of the level of deliberation to the question of fairness, but also the element that is actually often not focused on, but by adding at least gave the opportunity to the Assembly members actually to go beyond the reduction of 40% if they wanted to. In the case of the Global Assembly, there was a deliberative process within the Knowledge and Wisdom Committee that led to the question that the Assembly members from the Global Assembly looked at, which was looking at fairness and effectiveness in a way that was much more about meta-deliberation and supporting engagement from the Assembly members about the motivations for what fairness and effectiveness would be. So the question we're asking at this point is, what next for citizens' assemblies and systemic transformation? Can the current climate citizens' assemblies, as they are currently designed, really challenge the regime by which they've been instituted? So this is, for me, a question of whether we can actually tweak the model to really engage with the systemic elements, or some people would say this is actually, there are embedded issues in the model itself and we cannot use it to profoundly actually address some systemic concerns. We in the paper, we are making several recommendations that are up for discussions. The first one, so first there are general recommendations, and then we're looking at more specific recommendations for either top-down or bottom-up assemblies. The key element that we suggest in terms of general recommendation is, first of all, to look at designing the processes with a systems change lens from the outset. There's been no process, as far as we know, that has truly embedded system change in the design from the outset. And there's currently a prototype being initiated in Sweden that using a system change framework. And that would be interesting to see what we can learn from that. The most advanced process, as far as we're aware, was the Scottish Climate Assembly, which tried to bring a system change lens, but there were many limits to that, and that's explored in the paper in quite a lot of details. The Global Assembly tried to do that by looking, for instance, at bringing different perspectives in the Knowledge and Wisdom Committee, acknowledging different worldviews and bringing indigenous knowledge, for instance, in the framing of the assembly. But I think there's a need for a lot more innovation and testing in this field. The second point is around the need to focus on what we call controversies rather than consensus building. And there was a major learning for me from the Convention Citoyenne which initially there was within the committee, the governance committee, tensions between different people saying we need to design the process really focusing on controversies, and others were more interested in actually consensus building. My personal interest right now would be to actually focus on controversies, because that would allow the trade-offs to be explored in more depth than they currently are. We need to allow citizens more freedom to set the agenda and shape the process, because we can see in some instances that citizens themselves bring up issues that are more systemic. It's actually the way the process are designed that are limiting this exploration. What we call for as well is this idea that we need to facilitate emotional engagement with the crisis. The Habermasian kind of approach to deliberation is grounded into the principle of the exchange of rational arguments, but there's more and more research being done on the need to engage people on a more emotional level. And this is the way I would describe it personally, is that almost like 3 levels. The top level, the current political debate, which is at the level of opinions and arguments. The second level would be more at the level of the values and beliefs, and to some extent that's, I think, where the current citizens' assemblies are. But there's probably a deeper level, which is around governing sentiments and hopes and fears. And this is what the processes like Theory U, for instance, Otto Scharmer, are really good at doing. And I think the deliberative processes can learn from other processes as well. Another element is to invest effort into engaging the broader public. So it's around communication and media, combining deep deliberation with wider participation, so the connection between what people call the mini public and the maxi public. Also embed reflective evaluation that supports iterative and ongoing joint learning. I think there's a call here for academics to actually step out, potentially out of their comfort zone, and really support practitioners to design processes where we can learn in a way that is much more iterative. And finally, what we call here going beyond inclusion. There's a lot more research that is happening at the moment, which is about looking at beyond just simply sortition, but actually calling for engagement with the principle of equity and equality, and not just assuming that sortition brings inclusion. And finally, and I'm conscious that I'm already running 11 minutes, but this is about the need for more power literacy and in terms of theories of change. How does change happen? And this is a call for an acknowledgement that top-down citizens' assemblies commissioned by power holders committed to opening space for system change need to embed a recognition of politics, power, and the willingness to let go of control. But also for bottom-up citizens' assemblies to redirect power, and by that I'm using the term that has been recently used by Sonia Busu and Adrian Buer in their publication. It's about reclaiming participatory governance and also building collective efficacy, not just looking at individual efficacy. And finally, and this is for me where I think that there's in the context of the polycrisis, we're facing more and more challenges, and potentially a goal could be to have permanent chambers that are there in preparation for system change moments, especially in the context of adaptation. And we're seeing in the brief, we're illustrating this with case studies about what's happening in France, for instance, at the moment around management of the commons, water scarcity, and adaptation. My final comment would be about the call for institutionalizing mini public. At the moment, it seems to be very closely tied up with top-down approaches to governance, which can actually hinder system change. So these are all the reflection, and we'd love to hear your feedback in the breakouts and in the survey we'll share in a minute.
Thank you so much, Claire. And I forgot to mention that Claire is, of course, from Iswe. She's not based at CAST. She's just working with CAST on this particular project. But that was really interesting. I'd like to offer the floor to a couple of commentators. And first of all, Arantxa, who's one of the co-founders of Deliberativa. So I guess maybe a practitioner's perspective, maybe some thoughts on what this might look like if you were having to deal with systems issues, if you have already. And anyway, the floor is yours, Arantxa. I don't want to force you to respond in a particular way.
Thank you, Graham. Yeah, let me answer in a systemic way. So thanks for the invitation. We are very thankful that such a reflection is being done on such an important subject with concrete and rich recommendations. And also convinced that we will learn a lot today from the group attending the call, of course. That said, I think I was either drunk or asleep when I accepted to intervene in this call. The topic is so complex, but at least I enjoyed reading Claire and Stuart's paper, and it made me think about our practice. So as you said, Graham, my view on this paper is from a practitioner point of view. From Deliberativa, we are now involved in the design of 2 regional climate assemblies in Spain, in Catalonia, in the Basque Country, run by the Catalan and Basque governments. So we are working, as you say in the paper, in top-down invited spaces that include, as you say also in the paper, hidden power, setting the agenda and terms of reference, limiting the scope, etc. So to resume, after reading the paper, we could agree with the diagnosis of points 1 and 2, and we wonder how we could apply your recommendations to the work we are doing. So first of all, maybe 3 concerns or questions that come to our mind when relating climate assemblies with the need of a systemic change. When preparing the climate assembly, how can we communicate about systemic change without excluding part of the political scope and its support to the process? So that's a concern we could have. Second, how to think about a systemic change at regional level when the rest of the surrounding regions and countries are not in that frame. So maybe here one of the answer could be the connection between different climate assemblies that is not happening yet, but should happen soon. And then the third concern may be a systemic change needs to look at all the parties involved and needs to have a global view on how the world system works. Is it contradictory with narrowing the mandates as we now tend to do? Is it possible in the time framing we have? And is it compatible with having concrete impacts on public policies? Beyond that, we agree with most of the recommendation. In fact, several of them are already things that we have in mind in order to improve the work of climate assemblies, although it doesn't mean we are managing to apply them. And it is very useful to have a detailed reminder here. For instance, I will just underline 4 of the recommendations, focusing on controversies rather than consensus building. So this is, I guess, what we try to do, focusing the mandate on dilemmas. Then allowing citizens from freedom to set the agenda and shape the process. Here, I must say, we are not there. We are there rather right now trying to involve the main stakeholders and political parties in the definition of the mandate. But that could be something for the future. Third recommendation, facilitate emotional engagement with crises. Yes, we should do that. And then the last one, invest substantial effort into engaging the broader public. So this is something very important we need to improve, and maybe the easiest of the recommendations that you are proposing. So the most difficult recommendation could be the first one, which is, I'm quoting, design processes with a system change lens from the outset, with an introduction to critical and system thinking as part of a learning phase of a mini public, and a session that articulates the political economy of climate change and looks at alternative models. So just two some reflections on that. Although having this willing, it seems to us that it has to do with the main difficulty we always have in those climate assemblies, that is to identify all the alternative models, some of them being carried by less legitimized communities and being less visible. And second point, it also leads me to the Buckminster-Fuller sentence you quote in the paper. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. In fact, climate assemblies are usually examining trade-off between existing or potential models. They are not building new models. In the ecosystem of democratic tools, we also need to support spaces where those new models are imagined. I'm thinking, among others, in citizens' laboratories, and that could feed climate assemblies. So finally, this leads us to the more global ecosystem around climate assemblies, also pointed out by the last Knoca report and the end of Claire and Stuart paper. So as you say in the paper, permanent citizen chambers could be a step forward to think about a systemic change, adding maybe that the citizens should be able to shape the model of those permanent chambers. And moreover, the system change, of course, needs to be pushed by the world political system and society. And do not forget that climate assemblies are only a part of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Arantxa. And I'd like to hand the floor over to Bobby Banerjee for his thoughts about this relationship between climate assemblies and systems change. Bobby, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Graham, for inviting me to participate in this workshop, although I have a feeling that you might regret it by the end of the day. So anyway, as the discussers, we were asked to give our feedback on two questions. One, whether citizens' assemblies can genuinely address systems level constraints, such as colonization, patriarchy, the capitalist neoliberal paradigm. And the second question was, what other ways of understanding systems and system change need to be taken into account? Let me address the first question first, because it's the easiest to answer. Can citizens' assemblies genuinely address systems level constraints? My answer is an unequivocal and resounding no, they cannot. And at the risk of sounding provocative, I'm even going to say they should not. Why? Because, and the briefing document alludes to this, decisions made in deliberative forums, in many cases, are characterized by vastly structurally unequal conditions that disempower marginalized populations. And I've reached this conclusion based on my own research over the last 20 years on violent conflicts in the extractive industries, like mining, oil, and gas. Yeah. So colonial modes of extraction of natural resources are very much alive and well in the so-called post-colonial world, and no amount of dialogue, right, or consultation can address these violent legacies. Let us not forget that dialogue is a weapon of the powerful, and any consensus that is reached when dialogue takes place under structurally unequal conditions is a form of hegemonic accommodation that just serves to reinforce existing power asymmetries, right? So in its quest for consensus, deliberative processes deny legacies of colonialism, of structural inequalities that persist in contemporary societies. And better procedural design of deliberative processes cannot address these inequalities because institutional, material, and discursive power, which constitutes the global political economy, they are the ones that determine the governance structures, right? In other words, processes can be deliberative without being democratic, yeah? It is hard to see how citizens' assemblies can empower marginalized populations, which is the solutions advocated in most liberal democracies. Because if there's one thing we have learned from the histories of revolutions and social movements of the last few hundred years, is that power is never given. It has to be taken. As the Native American Diné leader, Tom Goldtooth, reminds us, the system ain't broke. It was built to be this way. It is one thing for a citizens' assembly of middle-class white people in London or Paris or New York deliberating about the installation of additional streetlights in their neighborhoods, or calling for more policing of their local parks to prevent antisocial behavior. But a citizens' assembly of homeless people demanding more access to parks is not going to get much traction. Yeah. And the problem is compounded and much worse amongst marginalized populations in the so-called global South. I mean, do we really think that indigenous communities in Latin America or Africa or Asia can engage in deliberative discourse as equal citizens with powerful market and state actors intent on expanding mining and logging on indigenous lands? So those are the structural impediments that prevent citizens' assemblies from genuinely addressing system-level constraints. So let's now turn to the second question, which is a much harder one. What other ways of understanding systems and system change need to be taken into account? I think the first step is to acknowledge that the polycrisis, or the climate emergency that confronts us, is a direct result of the way our political economy is organized. By that, of course, I mean capitalism. I work in a business school where we frown upon the use of the C word, yeah? But it's the elephant in the room that has to be addressed, yeah? It is interesting that in this entire briefing paper, capitalism is mentioned twice. Both times to say, and I quote, that radical critiques on capitalism and political economy were absent in deliberative forums. So that is the system change we need. See, what's extraordinary about capitalism is that it produces ecological breakdown and then tries to sell itself as the only reasonable solution to ecological breakdown. So capitalism created the climate crisis, but the solution to the climate crisis is more capitalism: electric cars, green consumption, carbon trading, carbon offsetting. And lest you think I am some left-wing nutter ideologue, socialist political economy is not going to solve the climate crisis either, because both systems privilege economic growth, which remains unquestioned. I mean, think about it. Does the planet really care if it is being destroyed by capitalists or socialists? So it's also important to understand that the climate crisis is climate colonialism. The people that have contributed the least to the problem, yeah, from whose lands natural resources have been looted for hundreds of years to create European wealth, they are the ones who are dying and being dispossessed in disproportionate numbers. And the proposed solutions to the climate crisis, sustainable technologies, circular economy, renewable energy, they perpetuate the colonial injustice, right? So I have to drive a Tesla in a green-grown world, but at the end of the supply chain for a Tesla battery is a 12-year-old kid in the Congo with a pickaxe who is digging up the cobalt, so I can live in a green growth world, yeah? And who will probably die from climate change before I do. So it is important to understand that climate change is a colonial discourse. It is a racialized discourse. It is a gender discourse, because climate impacts have disproportionate effects on people of color, on women. So climate change is about climate injustice. And any transition to a decarbonized economy must also be a just transition. So I guess a radical approach to answer the second question to the polycrisis, I think we need some difficult answers to two questions: what we have to say no to and what we have to build. The first one is easy: what we have to say no to. Business as usual is simply not an option. Reliance on fossil fuels is not an option. The obsession with economic growth is not an option. In what we have to build is a different economy. We need to shift from economies of accumulation to economies of distribution. We need to shift from economies of competition to economies of cooperation. We need to shift from economies of extraction to economies of regeneration. And finally, we need to shift from economies of consumerism to economies of self-sufficiency. None of this can be achieved unless we embrace other forms of knowledge, other ways of being in the world, such as recognizing indigenous forms of knowledge. So while the Western production of knowledge about the earth has always been inextricably linked to the Earth's potential for creating wealth, many other cultures, like indigenous societies, have always had profoundly intimate relationships with nature based on kinship rather than resource exploitation and extraction. Relationships that reflect spiritual engagement, collective and reciprocal connections with animals, trees, rivers, the living and the non-living, as well as an ethos of custodianship for unborn generations. So finally, we need a system of governance that can comprehend an interconnected living planet, a time horizon of centuries, and the conditions for both human and non-human well-being. Otherwise, we run the risk of becoming the only species in the planet with sufficient intelligence to foresee our own imminent extinction, but too foolish to do anything about it. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thanks, Bobby. Well, that was a challenge. Can I just bring Claire and Stuart back into the space? So, and I just wonder, we haven't got as much time as I'd hope. It's taken us longer to get to this point, but we've got a few minutes. I'm just kind of interested to your response to these two challenges. One, I guess, we might classify as from someone who's practicing in citizens' assemblies, saying we can't go there, we can't go to some of this because, for example, for various reasons, like this would be seen as politically problematic. It would be seen it's very difficult to think about how we get an agenda to deal with these kinds of issues, through to what Bobby's saying, which is, we're just tinkering around the edges if we start. Sorry, I'm not going to paraphrase exactly what Bobby said, but that there's too much going on that actually the model cannot even begin to deal with the kind of crisis we're facing. So two very different interventions there. I don't know which one of you would like to respond first. You're looking at each other. I like that.
I'll start because Stuart started the presentation, so I'll jump and take the risks. But so what I'm hearing from Bobby is that one of the comments you make is that processes can be deliberative without being democratic, and for me that goes back to the core question of looking at citizens' assemblies as a tool, or whether we're looking at the deliberative capacity of the systems. And that's what personally I'm really interested in when we look at the work that John Dryzek or Jane Mansbridge have done, looking at actually the deliberative system. Because what I'm hearing from Bobby is that these are tools that are actually can't help solve or address the polycrisis. But if you're looking at the wider system, so if you're mapping where these citizens' assemblies fit in the system, you're not looking just at them as a tool. You're looking at, what's the role of media in that system? What's the role of, social movements and all the work that Donatella Della Porta has done on the need for deliberation that is much more bottom up. So that's one reflection for me, is that, as you said, power is never given, it has to be taken. It's like power doesn't give away power easily. This is what we're trying to do to some extent in the briefing, is acknowledge this. And for me, it's not about saying citizens' assemblies are the silver bullet. They need to be looked at as part of the deliberative system. So yeah, I'll hand over to Stuart maybe if he wants to continue, and we can go back to some of the other points you raised.
Okay. Thanks, Claire, and thanks both to Arantxa and Bobby for your thoughts on that. A lot resonating there, and yeah, certainly underlining that we haven't figured it out, me and Claire anyway. But hopefully we can, between us after this, discuss some of these issues more in the breakout groups. So to turn to Arantxa's comments first, I think there's a really important point, if I understand this right, about, let's say, being pragmatic and these sorts of processes being able to make some change happen, like, for example, you know, if policymakers are only going to go as far as point X, then let's, you know, there's a need to work within what's possible, shall we say, that versus kind of discussing the climate crisis as a huge, vast, systemic issue. If you discuss it like that, are you really going to be, you're not going to be able to dismantle capitalism by doing some citizens' assemblies. That's not what you said, but you know, perhaps that's the tension there. And I think there's a bit of a paradox here, that in some senses, the most sort of pragmatic and reasonable processes that are most able to make some change happen almost risk being the ones that policymakers, politicians are most comfortable with, that aren't going to push for real change, because you know, they're within some fairly mild parameters, if you like. Whereas talking about, say, for example, things like post-growth or challenging capitalism might be more sort of faithful to this systemic perspective, but you know, a few dozen people talking about those things and making recommendations aren't going to, you know, lead to that huge change. You know, it's unrealistic to expect that. But what I think they can do is give a voice to a challenge to that system in citizens' own terms. And I also think, and this may be moving on to Bobby's points, that I guess the point I was trying to make at the end of my slides, if the climate and ecological crisis is a systemic problem, a systemic crisis, then I think we have to, it makes sense to me to think about it in those terms. Otherwise, we're not really being faithful to what the problem is in the first place. It doesn't make it easy to do, but if this is a systemic problem, a systemic crisis, then we have to try and approach it in those ways. Now, I think Bobby was obviously not convinced at the idea of citizens' assemblies sort of being able to do some of the important work he talked about. Power not being given has to be taken. Whilst this might sound naive, I would hope that deliberative innovations, assemblies, could be, haven't yet been, but could be part of reclaiming some of that power, or we could at least try, as Claire's been doing with the global assembly there. So it's not a panacea, as Claire said. It's not going to resolve all these problems, but it could be part of the solution. I also think, in terms of what, you know, the different ways we can look at the climate crisis as a systemic problem, whether that's in terms of capitalism or the extractivism that Bobby talked about, are precisely the sorts of ways I think that we should be looking at these issues in these processes, and what we're trying to sort of advocate for. So yeah, essentially that we're advocating that we do encourage a perspective in those terms. And just to finish off, really, I have got lots of other scribbled notes, but Bobby talked about moving from competition to cooperation, and I do think that's what these processes, deliberative processes, climate assemblies, are trying to do. That we are the aspiration, I guess, is that citizens are trying to figure out these issues and trying to kind of propose responses and solutions to them. So I would hope that we can enable citizens to be part of that cooperation, shall we say? And I'll leave it there.
Okay, that's really helpful. We were hoping to have a bit more of a panel discussion, but we want to give some space for other people to offer their thoughts. I guess one of the ways that I'm just trying to get my head round quite how to articulate this, but I mean, one of the questions is whether or not citizens' assemblies can actually do this kind of systems work, or whether they are, because of the kinds of institutions that they are, that they can't, that they are only ever going to be scratching at the edges of this, and in potentially even making things worse by giving offering a charade of participation and engagement. And I think that's a really interesting question for us to sort of to take into the breakouts, is to whether or not the model is broken in the sense it can't do this work, or we will break the model trying to do this work. And so I don't know what the answer to that is, but certainly it's one that we definitely should be asking ourselves. So we're going to give everybody, because we believe in as good digital health as possible, we're going to give everybody a 10-minute break to stretch your legs, go and get yourself a drink, dwell on some of the things that you've heard in the first part of this, and then we're going to go into 4 breakout groups. We're going to talk a little bit about the kinds of issues. Well, we're going to talk a lot about the kinds of issues that have been raised by Claire, by Stuart, by Bobby, and by Arantxa. So we'll see you all back here in about 10 minutes, and you will be at that point have been allocated to a group. There'll be one of the speakers in that group with you, and along with someone from Knoca, who will be able to sort of take notes and make sure we guide the process well. So see you all in about 10 minutes. Thank you. I've got a systemic headache. That was a really interesting conversation, and I think we could have gone on for, well, I know we could have gone on for a lot longer. I was going to just feedback, if I feedback briefly from my group, and then I'll call on someone for the other, I don't know if it's the other facilitators or whatever. I mean, we had a really lots and lots of ideas came out. I think I'll just pick out 3 or 4 that I thought were really interesting. One point that was made was these are already sort of transformational, and in some ways systems changing spaces already, because citizens are doing things that they wouldn't normally be doing, and so we mustn't forget that sort of transformational political moment, and particularly if we start being much more sensitive to questions of emotional or designing these spaces with emotions much more in mind, that they are already sort of transformational spaces. The second question was about the design, and now maybe we should be thinking about assemblies can do certain types of system change work, maybe ideational work, maybe visioning work, but we shouldn't expect them to be doing, kind of, as someone says, we can't expect an assembly to destroy neoliberal capitalism over a number of weekends. Also, we were talking about how we can work with sortition as one aspect of recruitment if we're trying to recognize particular vulnerabilities within communities. And so I think at the end, I think there was and this isn't just my particular perspective, we are perhaps putting too many expectations on one model. It's not a silver bullet. Someone else made the point that we might see this as part of a sort of radical incrementalism. But overall, I think a point that Bobby made in his talk and also in our breakout group is just as we've seen with participatory processes around the world, particularly in the majority world, we've got to be really careful that assemblies don't become weaponized and don't become co-opted spaces. And how do we do that if at the same time we're trying to do systems change work? So I'm still left with the question about whether we try, if we try and do this work, we will break the citizens assembly model. But maybe we should try. Maybe we should give it, we should definitely try. And if we break it, we break it. So that's what's come out of our group. Some of that's falling out of my head and probably was more about me than others. But at one of the other groups, Mark, who was from your group?
Well, Claire was in our group, so we agreed that Claire would be perfect to give a few thoughts, if you're still willing, Claire.
Yeah, I'll try my best.
How's your brain, Claire?
Frozen. No. Actually, what the way the conversation started was actually reflecting back on the question we were asked to discuss in our group, and what one of the participants was saying is that in a complex system you can't predict what's going to happen as a result of a change in the system. So by assuming that citizens' assemblies can lead to system change, that was actually not really embracing system change in itself. And they were lots of examples that were brought up to illustrate the fact there are models that could be used to go a bit deeper, and citizens councils were mentioned in Austria working on controversies, how you connect with the maxi public, and using tools like Polis, for instance. So there were practical suggestions, but at that point there was then a challenge about, we've been told that, Bobby is telling us that there's a deconstruction of the concept and the method of citizens' assembly, but what's the theory of change for reconstruction? And that led me to say, actually, there's a question here around collective power and collective responsibility, but also as practitioners or academics or people working in this field, what's our individual responsibility and power in that change, and reflecting on what, to some extent what you're saying, Graham, do we need to keep experimenting and at the risk of breaking the model? But actually, this is what's needed at this point in the current context facing the crisis we're facing. So I don't know if that does justice, but there was so much more that was shared, and yeah, it was recorded, so that's good.
You can watch it again. Morten, your group, who was feeding back from your group?
Yeah, Liz, you say a few words, and then I'm gonna add if I have anything more.
Yeah, I agreed again. Just after in the chat, Morten, I'm here to save you, Morten. I hope I do it justice, because I wasn't taking notes, but yeah, I think the thing that we covered a range of things. I think we focused more on the first question: is it possible? Firstly, I think there was maybe a bit of a mixed view on that. I think the Global Assembly came up as an example of where it certainly gives hope that it might be possible in terms of the way that was seen as a prototype, at least, and some of the learning from that, and how that might be used to influence the way citizen assemblies are done around that systems change framing, but recognizing also the limitations, and it was a prototype and not to kind of set it up as the panacea. I think also we said that the danger is also that by even saying we want to get systems change as a result of citizens' assemblies, we are in danger of sort of instrumentalizing it and trying to influence the process. So there was a concern there by even saying we're linking it to systems change. What if citizens don't actually come up with recommendations that link to systems change? And so is there sort of a danger that it could be used in that way and not seen as a neutral process? The other point that came up was, again, the purpose, that system change is one aspect of citizens' assemblies, but there's also something about the way they are done can build confidence and capability. And I think there was a point made earlier, I think by Rose in the chat, that about this ability to engage and deliberate and have dialogue, and that part of the reason we are sometimes caught up with these bigger, more polarized issues is because that's not happening. So there's also a contribution that citizens' assemblies can make in that respect. There was also a recognition that there is a kind of ecosystem with other methods out there as well, and that how might we draw on those, donor economics, working in different sort of stakeholder spaces. So there's what can we build on and work on, rather than just seeing that citizens' assemblies is a sort of panacea. And I think there was a real kind of a call to kind of not lower expectations, but just to say it's not just sort of set it up as, again, the sort of silver bullet. And I think also there was a concern that by linking it too much to systems change, that it could also scare off citizens from engaging in it if it was sort of framed too heavily in that way. And I think that's probably, yeah, the last point, just to say, and I think there was an important a perspective that came from one of the group who comes from the South, the sort of colonized South, is that just looking at the nature of this group, and what kind of systemic kind of patterns and power dynamics are also getting replicated, and just recognizing that she was the only person in our group from the South, the colonized South, and how are we just recognizing what impact that has in terms of our own dialogue and discussion. So that was, I think, important reality check in the here and now. So I hope that's sufficient, Morten. Is there anything to add that I missed?
No, that was a beautiful wrap up. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Stina, did you have thanks, Liz, that's fantastic. Liz should be the rapporteur for all groups. Not that Claire or I were rubbish, but it's very good. Stina, who was speaking from your group?
Well, we didn't actually get to agree on.
I'll just say we never agreed anything in my group. I just did it.
No, okay, yeah. Well, Stuart was in my group, so Stuart, you can maybe support me. But I would just like to point out two main discussions we had. That one was the citizens in the climate assembly. They are all part of the system as such. So maybe it is a very big task to sketch what all the different challenges in the system is, and maybe they don't all agree that there is a challenge or that the system is doing wrong. So we should be aware of that when talking about systems change, that we are maybe also a group that agree on some stuff that not all citizens necessarily agree on. And that led us also to the question in the draft, pointing at integrity versus neutrality. And as facilitators, we should maybe go from neutrality, saying that we are neutral, to have integrity instead, and be visible and about where we are, and that we are not neutral. And that led us to a discussion about researchers and presenters of evidence. Are they neutral, or can they be neutral? And yeah, that was also a bigger discussion. And this was only a very small part of all the very diverse input we had in our discussion. So Stuart or others from the group, please support if you have anything to add. But this was the main points my brain drew out of it.
I've got a couple of, I'll just quickly jump in. I've got various scribbled notes. So we started off with the question, can they do this? And there was a resounding, well, not from everyone, but there was a sense that yes, they can, but the processes need to happen more regularly, more at scale, and to also address other issues like inequality as a question of how wide the processes need to go. Let's try and pick one or two other things quickly. Yeah, two things. One was a question of whether facilitators and those running the processes have the tools and the ability to do this sort of work. That came from someone who was very involved in delivering processes. And the other one was about the need to build a movement and to lobby for when there are processes on the horizon or are going to happen, to really push for the kind of conditions we've been talking about to be in there. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, you've let him get him back. Get Mr. Capstick back, and get Claire back into the space as well. So Claire, are you coming in as well? Yes, great, fantastic. So Stuart, Claire, what are you going to take away? First of all, the question is, I raised the question about will systems change break the model? Will this seminar break your will?
actually really interested in is who's missing in this group. And it's been mentioned, you know, that they are actually, we are mainly from global north of Europe, and there's this parallel seminar happening at the moment on GR&D network, which is looking at global north and south processes. And so I'm reflecting on actually, as part of this conversation, who's actually missing to inform the next iteration of this briefing. And I think it's actually really important, because when we were designing and delivering the Global Assembly, what struck me the most actually is the people wanted to be part of in the assembly, run communities assembly, for instance, which was the more participatory model. Most of them were coming from global south countries. And I think, you know, we can be a bit self-indulgent maybe in saying, you know, these systems in the global north won't fix it, and as if global north were going to fix it. But for me, there's so much we need to learn from actually practices in the global south, and the work that is done by people like Nico Curato and many others. I think we need actually to look at the power, as you know, a community we have, and actually the limits in our system thinking. And I think that's to some extent that's where I completely agree with Bobby, where I'm not sure as a tool right now that's going to address these systemic questions, because we're designing them in, you know, with a particular worldview and mindset. And so and this is one of the reference in the briefing actually, in reference to the work Nicole has done around democracy in time of misery. I think we have, as the polycrisis unfolds, and that's something at the moment I feel we're not also really confronted with enough in the global north, is that we are engaging with this topic in a way that is quite disconnected from the reality of the crisis. So what can we learn from what people are actually doing in the global south, and not assume we will learn how to change this system from our current worldview and mindset.
Stuart, any thoughts you want to take away? Can you still speak?
I can still just about speak. I don't know whether what will come out of my mouth makes any sense, but no, it's been a really good discussion. I'm really looking forward to just to looking at, you know, if people have been able to offer some comments in that form we set up, to look back through the chat. And I think there's a lot we need to sort of reflect on things. And, you know, at the moment, it's a little hard to sort of bring it all together at the moment. I mean, a couple of final comments is that, where I'm coming from on this, and I feel sometimes a bit of imposter syndrome when it comes to deliberative democracy and assemblies and so on, is I do come at this position as someone who got involved in research and do what I do because I'm a climate change researcher. You know, I want the world to change. I think that the climate crisis is terrifying and unjust and appalling, and so I think climate assemblies and other processes do have the scope and the potential to help move things in the right direction, as part of, you know, lots of other things that I hope will move things in the right direction. But you know, as others have said, are not a panacea, but I think are part of the solution. And certainly, if you compare them to where we are in the UK, where I live, where it seems like the political system is completely broken and utterly incapable of dealing with the climate crisis, except in very narrow ways, then, you know, we've got to find some other way of doing this. One other thing that I thought might actually come up more, but someone has written in the chat, Karen has written in the chat, was this question of what is a system? You know, we're talking about this thing, system change, systems thinking. I think it can mean lots of different things. It can mean the complexities of everyday life. You know, how we live our lives is totally bound up with consumerism and work and culture, you know, all these words which just mean the complexities of life, and colonialism and capitalism. So I guess there isn't one definition of what a system is, and maybe there's, maybe there are multiple systems, a multiverse of complexity. But I think to at least take as the starting point that this topic is hugely complex, and it's not just about tweaks to the current way of doing things, I think I still sort of cling to that, and I haven't heard anything that convinces me otherwise, although I certainly have more doubts.
Okay. Well, leaving a Knoca seminar with more doubts it strikes me as a positive thing. I think this has been a great session. That I know from talking to lots of people who have worked in this area, who are both committed Democrats and committed climate activists, that there is, that there's been a lot of positivity around what we've seen with climate assemblies, which really have only been taking place over the last 3 to 4 years. Let's remember this. This is a very new model. It's, there's some concern about the nature that they're government sponsored, they're limited in their agendas, they're very policy focused, and there's certain things they're not getting at. And so I really thank Claire, and I thank Stuart, and then I thank Arantxa for her practitioner perspective. I thank Bobby for offering a much more radical perspective on the question. But I thank all 4 of you for helping us open up this space, because we have been talking about this as at the side. There's been lots of side conversations around this, and what's clear from this discussion today is there's a lot of appetite for thinking this through. I really don't think we've come out with any answers, but I never expected we would do. I think there's lots of experimentation still to do. I think we should be really we should recognize that we're still very much working in a niche. We're still very much working these processes are still very much away from the centers of power. And the question is, I repeat the question I had earlier, I guess, which was, this may break the way that citizens' assemblies work, but maybe if that's the case, they need to be broken. I saw that Oliver talked about maybe we're stretching, but we'll keep the variety of metaphors going here. But thank you for taking forward this conversation. Thank you so much, as I say, to Claire and Stuart for starting it. They are really looking forward to having some comments on their work. So please do use this opportunity to engage. We have got a couple more events coming up, one of which again actually involves Stuart. He's obviously our favorite person at the moment. He doesn't realize he's doing it, but we're in a couple of weeks' time, on the 12th of June, we're looking at our impact evaluation framework. That actually also interestingly has a systems component to it. So I think we might revisit some of these conversations. And then on the 21st of June, we've got our annual event where we're having a particular focus on some of the sort of innovations around climate practice. And I know that the Swedes are going to actually talk about the way that they're going to try and use systems modeling within their assembly. So as I say, no satisfactory answers, way more questions, and way more things for us all to do. But if that's a good workshop. So thank you for everybody. Thank you to my DBT colleagues for organising the technology so well. And I look forward to seeing you all in future discussions on this and other matters climate assembly. Take care, everybody.